This would be unlike the other one. If we go back, you see with the track page view, you're only passing in one string value. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, would you want to start a new session in, say, your application, or is that per activity that you do a new session?
You would want to do that, you're talking about in the Google Analytics, the start new session.
Yeah.
Right? It depends on how you do it. In this case, if you had like a single activity structure, then it would be okay to start your session there, but it's not the best idea if you have multiple activities. You wouldn't want to do that in each activity.
Right.
So,
okay.
Yes, we could do that in our launcher activities, probably the best place to do it. So.
You said it is, go to the previous code.
Okay.
It says help page. I mean, it's your reference, right? What is help page?
Help page here would be an example of, like if you have a help page, that you just want to click on that gives more information about your app. So with the tracking, with the event tracking method, there are four parameters that you pass in, and these parameters, you have to be consistent with them, because if you change them up across, you should change them up across different events that you're doing, but you have to make sure that you group them according to the action, according to your category, so that you get consistent values across the board. So an example of, say, a category could be a media player, where maybe you have a media player that's used in different instances across your app, and your actions would be where the user could play or pause or stop or skip. You have these buttons and stop the media or whatever. The label could be, well, the label is optional, and the value of that is optional. So when I thought about how you could use a label, that could be, for example, if you have, like I said, multiple media players across different apps, you may have a label for one media player that may play, music, and your other media player will play videos. So that would be two different types, and that's a way that you would use your label. And maybe maybe for value, you could use that for, like if your user set a volume on your media player, you would maybe set the volume so have an average idea of how users tend to, like what volume they maybe tend to play the music at. So also your category and action pairs need to be unique, so keep that in mind. Here's an example of some event tracking. Same sort of situation where like on this video page, and same thing, let's say that, for example, that this is a single activity structure that you have. And this on create, we're starting a new session. And in our on-click listener, we are tracking an event here instead of, and notice that in the last one, we were tracking, in our on-click listener, we were tracking a page view, but here we're tracking an event. It's going to be different. And then we have a video ID that we're storing instead of, or we can keep those blank.
It's a general question. How much would be the performance load?
The performance load for tracking would be pretty minimal, because we're storing this data into a database locally before it gets sent over to the servers. So every time you call tracker.track event, you're not sending data immediately over to any servers. And that's a pattern that I'm sure you've seen even in the other talks. A lot of other people have talked about it. So I think Google Analytics and the Google people are probably on the right track with storing locally and then sending all of it as batch information at interval times. So let's go on to e-commerce tracking. We talked about it before. As we're tracking our shopping carts, we're tracking our in-app purchases. There are two items that you need. You can't just send over strings when you're tracking transactions. You have to send over a transaction, and you have to send over all items underneath it. So you create a transaction object, and you add items to that transaction, and then that transaction gets submitted to the servers, or gets submitted to your database before going to the servers. So with e-commerce tracking, I've put the processes as step 1, 2, and 3 down here, and then I showed on the code sample where you do your step 1s, 2s, and 3s. So you have a transaction builder, and that should have, I think there's a mistake here. This needs to say .build at the end, because the transaction builder is this needs to do .build so it returns a transaction to that instance. But here, we're doing onPurchase confirmed, and we're passing in a purchase. Now, this purchase object is not it's not part of the Google Analytics SDK. This is something that, it's a pretend object. It's part of this world where we have this purchase page. So you would send in your own object here, and you would use it to build your transaction object. So you would pass in a store name. If you have any shipping costs or total taxes or anything like that, you would pass that to your transaction object. And you add that transaction object to your tracker. Then you go ahead and you start adding your line items as item objects onto your tracker. So you're adding these items onto your tracker, and the way that you correlate your tracker, the way that you correlate your items to your purchase, to your transaction object, is by your purchase ID. So there's one ID that all those items will have that corresponds so that you know that, that all of those items belong to that one transaction. So in case, let's say for example, you have several transactions that you'll be adding here, you could, that's how the tracker would know which items belong to what transaction. So let's continue to custom variables.
Okay, but a question
Yes.
on e-commerce tracking. I want to avoid counting something multiple times and getting a bunch of inflated numbers. I don't really know a good way to avoid it though, because people install an app they pay for, they uninstall, reinstall, or they have in-app purchase items and you download them again, you go out and confirm the purchase and download them again. I don't know good ways to avoid getting inflating your e-commerce numbers. Do you?
No, and I'm not sure that this would be used in the same way as maybe the scenario that you're talking about. Well, in my mind,
that's exactly what it would be used for.
So when a user,
Yeah, when a user makes an in-app purchase, of course you're going to record that as a transaction. But if they're simply reinstalled and they're going back and restoring their purchase, I haven't gone into a way to differentiate that. Or if it's a paid app, you're trying to look for the first install of it and count that, but they completely reinstall. There's no real state. There's nothing to tell you that it wasn't their first install.
I see. So you're saying, so you're saying if a user makes a purchase, they uninstall the app and they don't have to make that purchase again. They're just reinstalling the app.
Right, and you're not getting any real money from just people reinstalling.
Right. That could probably be a different workflow. So maybe in this situation, you wouldn't send them, you would check an ID and make sure that, this could be a situation where you check the users, for example, on the iPhone, you can do that, right? They would check your ID, your Apple ID, for example, against a list of what you already have. So that sounds like, I feel like you're talking about a Google Play situation where, and this is more of a situation like, let's say someone can purchase t-shirts in your app, or they can purchase some sort of product in your app. So it could be a different, maybe it's a different, we can talk about it later if you want. I would like to know more about the scenario that you want.
Very uncommon to me. I mean, people who are selling virtual currency games, you want to track that as an income transaction. There's real money. You're getting real money from it.
That's true. Well, look, come talk to me later. I'd like to hear what you have to say. So please come talk to me. Okay, so let's move on to custom variables. This custom variables are an upgrade from version 1's user-defined segments. Like I said, my app was registered for version 2, so I didn't really get to go into a lot of depth about user-defined segments. But I can tell you some differences about them. For custom variables, there are 3 scopes. You have a visitor scope, a session scope, and a page scope, whereas user-defined segments only have the visitor level custom variables available to you. For user-defined segments, there's only one that you can use. So you would have to overload if you wanted to track more information, you would have to overload your user-defined segment. Whereas with custom variables, you have 5, so you get to overload less. I mean, you still may have to, but you can do less overloading, I would say, if you wanted to track more than the 5 slots that they give you. Page-scoped custom variables, they overlap event tracking functionality, so I would suggest saving your 5 slots that you have for session variables and perhaps visitor variables if you needed to use it that way. You use the set custom variable method, which defaults to page scope, so make sure that you specify what scope you want to use. Otherwise, you'll be confused about why on every page the user is making a transaction. This set custom variable method does not send data to your database, to your HIT database. You have to, it simply sets a variable, so you have to make sure that you call one of the other tracking methods after you call the set custom variable. So here's an example where in our on-subscription complete, in this situation, let me paint a picture for you. In this situation, let's say you have a sales rep, where you have a fleet of sales reps that all have your corporate device, and they're able to create and cancel subscriptions via your app. So in this situation, we are saying that a user, we have 2 methods here. We have on-subscription complete and on-subscription cancel. And so in your on-subscription complete method, the user, once the sales rep has created a new subscription and the subscription's been processed, we get a Boolean back and we determine, well, we don't determine anything. We just set a custom variable saying that this particular sales rep has created a new subscription, and we do it at the session level. So if you see the last parameter in that set custom variable, the last parameter represents your session, your variable scope level, and the first one represents the slot that you're putting it in, and then the other one is just information that you have. And then the track transaction is where you would actually do your track transaction there. I didn't have enough space on the slide, so I just set it to a helper method where you pass in your subscription and your tracker and you do your track transaction. And then on subscription cancel, you see I set the custom variable to be 2, whereas I probably could have used the slot 1 because I've already tracked the event at this point. So there's no danger of, I already did the tracking, so that means that my custom variable has been sent over as a hit, and my track transaction has been sent over as a hit as well. So, so when you go down to your subscription cancel, you can probably use slot 1 because you've already done the transaction tracking and the custom variable tracking from the previous one. You've already done that, so there's probably no danger in overriding. But overriding is a danger that you could face, so be careful. And when I say overriding, I mean overriding your slots. All right. What else could we possibly track? We could track a user's touch order on the layout. So, for example, we could do something similar to the downstream tracking on Open Web Analytics. We could track a user's touch location on the screen, where you set up clickable regions on your layout and you perform event tracking on click. And that could give you information about where do your users tend to click. Do they start from the top and go down, or do they start from the sides and go in? You can gather information like that. You can track a user's navigation through your app, which is more of what the user tracking part does. So, in essence, what we want to do is when we look at our tracker, our Google Analytics tracker, we could do some creative things to it in terms of, we could maybe apply structural patterns to broaden its capabilities. We could use the decorator pattern, apply the decorator pattern to it and submit our data to in-house databases. We could which I like the idea of using an adapter so that you can switch out your different analytic services. You may want to try Pillock down the line or Snowplow, so it's probably a good idea to use an adapter. You could replicate what has been done. You could use a lot of the sessions where all of our sessions, well, all the ones I've attended talked about saving data, saving your data and then submitting it to your own servers. You can do all that yourself in addition to, well, let me just continue. You can also overload, your variables. So you can pass key value pairs that tie data that you don't want to send to your Google Analytics servers. You can essentially tie a key to your custom variable and tie it back to data that you're saving locally, or not locally, but to your own in-house servers. And then do a comparison later on. You can do your comparison when you do your reporting. So let's talk about the Google. I'm sorry.
Do you have sample code for on that?
No, not in this. Not here. No, it's not in my slides. But we can talk about sample code or some examples.
And also, so you write everything to the local database, right?
Right.
So does it get cleared every day? I mean, after the scene?
It gets,
how does it work?
yes. It gets cleared after your network dispatcher gets the okay from the pipeline requester that.
So do you have any control over it?
Well, if you roll your own, yeah, you have control over it. If you're using Google Analytics, you don't have any control over when it gets cleared. The only thing you could do is you could possibly try to line up in your Google Analytics XML file, your configuration file. You can set when data gets dispatched, and you can try to tie up or try to figure out when the next dispatch is going to occur, and then maybe intercept and get data then, or something like that.
Do you have the screenshot for the XML?
I'm sorry?
Do you have the screenshot for the XML?
That's a good idea. I should have put that screenshot in there. So I should be writing this down right now, but I can't go to my bag. But that's a good idea. I'll keep that for the future. Let's talk about the reporting framework right now. So this is an example of what your account would look like. So you would have your Google Analytics account. You would log in using a regular email address, and you may have several properties that you've set up, where a property corresponds to a website or a blog or a mobile app, something like that. Underneath your property, for example here, let's say this property represents a mobile app, and you would have two profiles, where one profile could represent, for example, your Android device, whereas the other profile would represent your iOS device, or it could be different versions of your Android device that you're representing here. It just depends on how you feel like you should set it up. And underneath that, you have your reports. And I want to point out to you that you cannot create reports across profiles. So keep that in mind when you are doing your configuration, when you're in your configuration step. That if you want to track all data across, say for example, let's say you set up two different versions of your Android app. It's probably a better idea to keep the same profile if you want to be able to continue to analyze the data across the two different versions. But if they're totally, completely different, then you would want to create two different profiles.
What was that you were saying? Sorry, on upgrade to keep the same profile.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, on like upgrade to need to keep the same profile. Yeah.
Well, it depends on what sort of solution that you're looking for. So if you were to upgrade your own Android app, so let's say your Android app is now using fragments, maybe you want to, depending on if you have a whole new layout, you may want to create a whole new profile for it. But if you keep the same layout, then maybe you want to probably keep the same profile ID. So. Yes.
Sorry, could you explain what is a profile there? I mean, what kind of profiles you can configure?
Yes.
Examples.
I'm sorry?
I need more examples so that I can understand it.
Okay, so the example that I gave was under a property. For example, let's say you have a mobile app. So under your mobile app property, you could have an Android instance of your mobile app. You could have an iOS instance. So those would be an example of two different properties that you're tracking. Or if you have one Android, let's say your company only has one Android, you're not doing any iOS work. You have one Android app, and you've made huge changes to it. It's a whole new app. It's a beautiful thing now. You would maybe want to create a new profile ID to track information because it's going to look completely different. And maybe you want to track different page views or something like that. Maybe the analytics, maybe when you do your analysis, it wouldn't correlate in any way at all. So
do I have to pass this profile ID or something
yes.
when you're tracking?
Yes, you have to pass your profile ID. Oh, I didn't pass it there. Where am I passing it? Here, event tracking. So this is where you would pass your, when you call start new session, you pass your profile ID right there. Okay, I think where was I? App categories. I'll try to move faster because I wanted to get to, I thought that I would move faster. I guess I'm not. I wanted to get to some other things. So there are 4 different app reporting categories that you can use that you need to know about. So there's acquisitions, users, engagements, and outcome. And here you can see I've put the 5 W's in slots where I thought they should go. So under engagement, you want to know the ways in which, what are people doing with your app? What ways are they using your app? Your targeted outcome, your outcomes would be maybe a good example of why, because you can understand by your outcomes if your users are engaging and meeting your goals that you set for them. If they're hitting the targeted objectives, then you understand why they're using your application. If they're not hitting targeted objectives that you set, then you understand, you need to try to figure out the other reasons why they may be engaging in your app. And then the users report category defines who, what, where, and when. So if you look at the dimensions and the metrics, which we'll talk about if we have time, you'll see how these correspond or correlate. So external data integration. I think we talked about this, about the reasons why you would want to externalize the data that you find in Google, that you're collecting to Google Analytics. This is why we would use the core reporting API, which we'll talk about. But you want to externalize your data because you may have dashboards that you're already using in your company that you need to correlate this data to. So that's why you would want to do it. That's a big reason for me. Let's talk about the core reporting API. There is an ability that you have where you can export your analytics data. You have several client libraries available to you, including Java and Objective-C and Ruby. Python and Objective-C are the only client libraries that are currently past the beta stage. So the other ones are not as, they're just not as baked. They're not done. All your data is returned in JSON format, and you can return your responses in paginated format or compressed. You can get compressed responses, which is good for bandwidth. You want to reduce your bandwidth. There's a quota on how much data you can pull down. It's 10,000 requests per day. And you have to register your app to get your full quota. Otherwise, you get a sad, sorry little tiny minuscule quota of data, and it's only really for testing. But if you want all your quota, you have to register your app. Let's talk about the query, and I think we should move forward to the sample query. But there are 4 required parameters. Your profile ID, a start and end date, and then metrics are required. The access token is strongly suggested, as we talked about before, so that you can get your full quota. And let's go to our sample query. So here we have where we're collecting, this is where we are calling the reporting API to get our results back that we've been feeding all the time via our app. So you may do this you may call this in one of your in-house apps, or one of your apps that's doing daily data gathering, if you will. So here we are gathering information about the number of visits that we're getting. And as you can see, we'll talk about this more, but there's metrics and filters. There's our start date and our match results. So some of these are required, like IDs is required, metrics is required, and start date and end date are required. The other ones are not. And we'll talk about how these compare to SQL statements in a second, because that was the best way that I can understand how this query works, is when I compared it to SQL. So here's my comparison that I made. Here's the SQL query and the Georgia. Why do I keep saying Georgia? I keep doing that. I'm from Georgia, so that's why I keep saying that. But it's a Google Analytics query. So that profile ID represents your table. So that would be part of your. That would be your from part in your select star from, where your table is your profile ID. Your select column is your metrics, and that's why that is a required piece of your core reporting query that you make to the API, because you can't get anything if you don't have any metrics. You need at least one. The dimensions corresponds to the group by clause of the SQL query, and then the filters correspond to your where. So cool thing, I put some additionally marks in there. Like I said, you can't query across profile IDs, but you can sort by metrics and dimensions, which is pretty cool. Okay, so dimensions and metrics. There are a maximum of 7 dimensions that you can call, a maximum of 10 metrics that you can call in one query. And not all combinations are valid, but you could go to the core reporting API and look and see, if you're looking for particular metrics, you can see what dimensions you could call with it to get something that makes sense. So the difference being, other than what we showed in that SQL comparison, is that the metrics are a measurement of user activity, whereas dimensions will group your metrics across any commonalities. So here are some interesting versus some common metrics that you would use. So time on site is pretty common. You would use that. Ad clicks, goal completions would be one, and the number of visitors. And then some interesting ones would be server connection time. So how long does it take it's pretty self-explanatory. Domain lookup time, all these different times. Unique social interactions, which is an interesting one because that is, you can only gather information from users, from social hubs that are partners with Google Analytics. So there's a whole list, but it's like Reddit and a couple of other ones. Pretty cool. Dimensions. Again, I've compared some common ones with some interesting ones, and you can have a look at that. The common ones would be your visitor types. For example, if a visitor is one of your subscribers versus if they're not, what sort of campaign that they sailed in on, what city, what region, what metro area that they're coming in from, and what search used. And I think a lot of this information, like if you look at city, metro, region, and you're wondering how in the world they're gathering this, it's because they're getting that from location, from an IP address that they use when they submit the data. Language, what search used, some interesting ones. Custom variable name in, where in has to be the slot number. So if you call custom variable 6, you're not going to get anything back because there are only 5 custom variables that you can call. Output, like we said, it's in JSON response format. The client libraries are available in, like I said, Python and Objective-C are the ones that are in general availability. And the Java client library is in beta, so I would suggest just go ahead and get down and dirty and parse your own JSON response when it comes back. I think that's the best thing you can do. So let's go into user story, which if I had timed this right, I probably would have made all that smaller and made this part bigger, because this is the part that's interesting to me. So let's talk about who. You want to know who your user is by individual if you're doing user tracking, or if you're doing Google Analytics, you want to know by demographic. So you need to know